Have you ever noticed something strange about love? The moments in life that bring the greatest joy often carry the greatest risk of pain. The deeper we care about someone, the more power they seem to have over our emotional world. A simple message from them can brighten an entire day. Their silence can feel heavier than the weight of the world. This raises a profound question that psychologists, neuroscientists, and philosophers have been trying to understand for decades. Why does loving someone deeply make us more vulnerable to being hurt? At first glance, love seems like the most positive force in human life. It motivates people to build families, form friendships, support one another, and sacrifice for those they care about. Across cultures and throughout history, love has been celebrated as the ultimate source of meaning. Yet hidden beneath this beautiful emotion is a quiet psychological paradox. The more we invest emotionally in another person, the more fragile our emotional stability becomes. This is not simply poetic language. It is rooted deeply in the architecture of the human brain. Modern neuroscience has revealed that romantic love activates some of the most powerful neural systems humans possess. Brain imaging studies conducted at institutions like University College London and Stanford University show that when people look at the face of someone they deeply love, regions associated with reward, motivation, and emotional attachment become intensely active. One of these systems involves dopamine, a neurotransmitter strongly linked to pleasure, desire, and anticipation. Dopamine is the same chemical that drives motivation toward goals, fuels excitement, and even plays a role in addictive behaviors. When we fall in love, dopamine levels surge in the brain, creating feelings of exhilaration and emotional intensity. This is why love can feel almost intoxicating. But the same system that produces joy also creates dependency. When someone becomes a primary source of emotional reward, our brain begins to treat their presence as something essential. And anything the brain considers essential becomes something it fears losing. Psychologists call this emotional dependency. It does not mean weakness. It is a natural feature of human bonding. Humans evolved as deeply social beings. For hundreds of thousands of years, survival depended on forming close relationships within groups. Being rejected or abandoned by others could literally threaten survival. Because of this evolutionary history, our brains are wired to treat social bonds as critical to safety and well-being. This is why emotional rejection can activate the same brain regions associated with physical pain. A famous study conducted by researchers at UCLA used brain scans to observe what happens when people experience social rejection. Participants played a virtual game in which they believed they were being excluded by other players. The scans revealed that the brain's anterior cingulate cortex, a region also involved in processing physical pain, became active during rejection. In simple terms, the brain reacts to emotional rejection in a way surprisingly similar to physical injury. This helps explain why heartbreak can feel physically overwhelming. But there is another layer to this story. The deeper the emotional investment, the more meaning we attach to the relationship. When we love someone, we do not simply enjoy their presence. We begin to weave them into our identity, our future, and our sense of belonging in the world. Psychologists call this process self-expansion. When people enter close relationships, their sense of self begins to merge with the other person. Their goals, emotions, and experiences become interconnected. This is why partners often begin to adopt each other's habits, interests, and ways of thinking. Love expands who we are. But expansion also increases exposure. If a person becomes part of our emotional identity, any disturbance in that relationship feels like a disturbance within ourselves. This is why conflicts in close relationships often feel far more painful than conflicts with strangers. When someone we barely know criticizes us, it rarely leaves a deep mark. When someone we deeply love does the same thing, it can shake our sense of self. In other words, love does not just open our hearts. It opens our psychological defenses. The more we love, the more access another person has to our emotional world. And this brings us to the heart of the paradox. Love gives life extraordinary meaning, but it also creates emotional vulnerability. The question is not simply why love can hurt. The deeper question is why the human brain is designed to accept this risk in the first place. Why would evolution create a system where the very emotion that brings the most joy can also bring the deepest pain? The answer lies in the extraordinary power of human connection. And understanding that power reveals something remarkable about the way the human mind works. To understand why loving deeply makes people more vulnerable to emotional pain, we must look beyond romance and examine something far more fundamental in human psychology: attachment. Long before people fall in love as adults, their brains are already learning how to connect, trust, and depend on others. These patterns are formed in early childhood through interactions with caregivers. The way a child experiences comfort, security, and emotional availability becomes a blueprint for how that person will later experience love. One of the most influential psychological theories explaining this phenomenon was developed by British psychologist John Bowlby in the mid-20th century. Bowlby proposed that humans are born with an innate attachment system designed to keep them close to caregivers, because proximity historically increased the chances of survival. When caregivers are responsive and emotionally available, children develop what psychologists call secure attachment. These individuals tend to feel comfortable with closeness, trust others more easily, and generally experience relationships as emotionally safe. But not everyone grows up with this sense of emotional security. When caregivers are inconsistent, distant, or emotionally unpredictable, children may develop anxious attachment. In this pattern, love becomes associated with uncertainty. As adults, people with anxious attachment often feel an intense need for reassurance, closeness, and emotional confirmation. They may love deeply, passionately, and intensely. But this intensity can come with a hidden cost. Because their emotional stability becomes closely tied to the responses of the person they love, even small signs of distance or ambiguity can trigger strong emotional reactions. A delayed message, a short reply, or a change in tone can feel like evidence that something is wrong. Research from Columbia University and the University of Toronto has shown that individuals with anxious attachment patterns often experience stronger emotional highs and deeper emotional lows in romantic relationships. Love becomes both a source of joy and a source of constant emotional uncertainty. There is also another attachment pattern known as avoidant attachment. People with this style often appear independent and emotionally self-contained. They may value autonomy and distance in relationships, sometimes feeling uncomfortable with intense emotional closeness. Ironically, avoidant individuals may appear less vulnerable to heartbreak, but their strategy often involves suppressing emotional needs rather than eliminating them. In reality, both anxious and avoidant patterns reflect different ways of protecting the self from potential emotional pain. Secure attachment, on the other hand, allows people to love deeply while maintaining a stable sense of self. But attachment styles alone do not fully explain why love can hurt so much. Another important psychological process is emotional investment. When people commit to someone emotionally, they begin to imagine a shared future. The mind naturally creates expectations about companionship, stability, and belonging. Over time, these expectations form a mental picture of what life will look like with that person. Psychologists refer to this as relational forecasting. The brain constantly predicts future emotional states. When a relationship appears stable, the brain integrates that relationship into long-term life plans. This is why breakups can feel so disorienting. It is not just the loss of a person. It is the collapse of an imagined future. Research in social psychology has shown that when people experience relationship loss, the brain must undergo a process similar to identity reconstruction. Plans, habits, routines, and emotional expectations suddenly need to be reorganized. This creates psychological shock. But there is another fascinating factor that amplifies emotional vulnerability in love. Human beings possess an extraordinary ability called emotional mirroring. Through specialized brain systems often associated with mirror neurons, humans instinctively synchronize with the emotional states of people around them. When someone we love feels happy, our brain often reflects that happiness. When they feel sad or distant, our brain can absorb that emotional tone as well. In close relationships, this emotional synchronization becomes extremely powerful. Partners often regulate each other's emotional states without even realizing it. A calm voice can reduce stress. A warm smile can lower anxiety. A cold silence can create deep discomfort. In neuroscience, this process is sometimes called emotional co-regulation. When two people bond closely, their emotional systems become partially interconnected. This is one reason couples often say they feel incomplete after separation. Their emotional regulation system had become shared. But this also explains something else. The closer two people become emotionally, the more influence they have over each other's emotional well-being. Love essentially creates a psychological bridge between two minds. And once that bridge exists, emotions can travel in both directions. This is why love can elevate people to extraordinary happiness. But it also explains why love can create such deep wounds when trust is broken or connection is lost. The human brain was never designed to love halfway. True emotional bonding requires openness, vulnerability, and trust. Without these elements, relationships remain shallow. But with them, the heart becomes exposed. The fascinating truth is that vulnerability is not a flaw in love. It is the very mechanism that allows love to exist. Without vulnerability, there would be no deep connection. Without deep connection, there would be no profound meaning in relationships. Yet this raises an even deeper question. If vulnerability is essential for love, how can people protect themselves from being destroyed by emotional pain? Is it possible to love deeply without losing emotional stability? Or is emotional pain simply the unavoidable price of meaningful human connection? The answer lies in understanding something most people misunderstand about love. And it begins with a surprising discovery from modern psychology about emotional resilience and self-identity. There is a moment that many people experience in love but rarely recognize while it is happening. At first, a relationship simply adds joy to life. Conversations feel exciting. Time together feels meaningful. The presence of another person enriches the world. But gradually, something subtle begins to change. The relationship stops being a part of life and slowly becomes the center of it. Psychologists sometimes describe this as emotional centralization. When love occupies more and more psychological space, other parts of identity begin to shrink. Friendships receive less attention. Personal goals become secondary. Hobbies, ambitions, and independent interests slowly fade into the background. The relationship becomes the primary source of emotional meaning. At that point, something dangerous quietly forms. When love becomes the core of identity rather than a part of it, emotional stability becomes fragile. If that single pillar is shaken, the entire emotional structure begins to collapse. This is why some people recover from heartbreak relatively quickly while others feel completely lost for months or even years. The difference often lies in how much of their identity was built around the relationship. A study published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology explored how individuals respond to romantic breakups. Researchers discovered that people who strongly define themselves through their relationship experience significantly more psychological distress after separation. Their sense of self had become entangled with the relationship itself. When the relationship ended, they were not only losing a partner. They were losing a part of who they believed they were. This phenomenon is sometimes called identity diffusion. The mind struggles to answer a fundamental question. Who am I now? For people who maintained a broader sense of self outside the relationship, recovery tended to be faster and more stable. Their lives still contained multiple sources of meaning. Friends, passions, ambitions, and personal values remained intact. But for those whose identity had narrowed around love, the loss created a deep existential gap. This reveals one of the most important truths about emotional vulnerability. The deeper the emotional dependency on a single source of meaning, the greater the potential pain when that source disappears. However, dependency alone does not fully explain why love can hurt so profoundly. Another powerful psychological force is expectation. Human beings are natural storytellers. The brain constantly constructs narratives about the future. When people fall in love, the mind begins writing an internal story about how life will unfold. The imagination paints images of shared homes, shared memories, shared aging, and shared dreams. These images feel real because the brain treats emotionally meaningful possibilities almost like memories of the future. Neuroscientific research has shown that imagining the future activates many of the same brain regions involved in remembering the past. In other words, when we imagine a life with someone we love, the brain begins to experience that imagined future as part of our personal history. This makes the relationship feel deeply rooted in our identity. But when reality suddenly diverges from that internal narrative, the brain experiences a form of psychological shock. The story collapses. The future that once felt certain becomes empty space. This process explains why heartbreak often involves confusion, disbelief, and emotional disorientation. It is not simply sadness. It is the brain struggling to reconcile two conflicting realities. One reality is the future it expected. The other is the present that now exists. This conflict creates emotional turbulence. Yet perhaps the most powerful factor behind emotional vulnerability in love is something that many people misunderstand. Trust. Trust is not simply believing that someone will stay. Trust is allowing someone access to our emotional core. When people truly trust another person, they lower psychological defenses that normally protect the mind. Vulnerabilities, fears, insecurities, and hopes are shared openly. In doing so, people reveal parts of themselves that they do not reveal to the world. This is what creates intimacy. But intimacy carries a hidden cost. The person who understands us most deeply also has the greatest ability to hurt us. A careless word from a stranger may be forgotten within minutes. The same word from someone we love can echo for years. This is not because the words themselves are stronger. It is because they come from someone who has access to the deepest layers of our emotional world. In psychology, this is sometimes referred to as emotional exposure. Love removes the protective armor people normally wear in social interactions. Without that armor, emotional experiences become far more intense. This explains the strange paradox that many people experience. The happiest moments of love feel almost magical. But when love breaks, the pain can feel unbearable. Yet this raises an important question. If love creates such powerful vulnerability, why do human beings continue seeking it again and again, even after experiencing heartbreak? Why does the human heart return to love despite the risks? The answer reveals something remarkable about the human mind. And it may completely change the way we understand emotional pain, resilience, and the true purpose of love in human life. If loving deeply can expose us to such powerful emotional pain, a final question emerges that has fascinated psychologists and philosophers for centuries. Why do humans continue to seek love again and again, even after heartbreak? Why does the human heart return to connection, despite knowing the risk of suffering? The answer begins with something fundamental about the human mind. Human beings are not designed for isolation. From an evolutionary perspective, connection has always been one of the most important forces shaping survival. For early humans living in small tribes, being socially connected meant protection, shared resources, cooperation, and emotional support. Being excluded from the group could dramatically reduce the chances of survival. Because of this history, the human brain developed powerful systems that reward bonding and punish social separation. This is why connection feels meaningful and loneliness feels painful. It is not simply emotional preference. It is biological design. Modern neuroscience continues to reveal how deeply connection is embedded in human biology. Studies from institutions such as Harvard Medical School and the University of Chicago have shown that long-term social isolation is associated with increased stress hormones, weakened immune function, and higher risks of anxiety and depression. In contrast, strong social bonds are linked with longer life expectancy, improved cardiovascular health, and greater psychological resilience. One of the most famous long-term studies in psychology, the Harvard Study of Adult Development, followed participants for more than 80 years. Researchers repeatedly discovered that the strongest predictor of long-term happiness and health was not wealth, fame, or career success. It was the quality of close relationships. Love, friendship, and emotional connection appeared to be among the most powerful factors shaping well-being throughout life. This suggests something remarkable. The human brain may be willing to accept emotional vulnerability because the benefits of connection are so profound. Pain is the risk. Meaning is the reward. Yet there is another deeper psychological reason why love remains central to human experience. Love allows individuals to transcend the boundaries of the self. When people care deeply for someone else, their emotional world expands beyond their own personal concerns. Another person's happiness becomes meaningful. Another person's pain becomes important. Life becomes shared rather than solitary. Psychologists sometimes describe this as relational meaning. When individuals feel connected to others, their sense of purpose often increases. Daily experiences feel more significant because they are part of a shared journey rather than an isolated existence. This may explain why people who experience loving relationships often report greater life satisfaction even when facing difficulties. Connection transforms the meaning of struggle. Challenges feel more bearable when they are faced together. But perhaps the most powerful truth about love is something that many people only realize after experiencing heartbreak. Love does not simply expose vulnerability. It also reveals emotional strength. When people survive emotional pain, they often discover capacities within themselves that they did not know existed. The process of healing forces the mind to grow, adapt, and redefine identity. Psychologists refer to this process as post-traumatic growth. While the term is often associated with major life crises, many people experience a similar transformation after deep emotional loss. Through reflection and recovery, individuals frequently develop greater emotional awareness, stronger boundaries, and a deeper understanding of their own needs. Pain becomes a teacher. This does not mean heartbreak is desirable or necessary for growth. But it reveals something important about the resilience of the human mind. The same emotional openness that makes love risky also makes transformation possible. Without vulnerability, there would be no heartbreak. But without vulnerability, there would also be no intimacy, no trust, no deep connection, and no emotional meaning. This leads to a surprising conclusion. The goal of love is not to avoid vulnerability. The goal is to develop the inner strength to remain whole even while loving deeply. Emotionally mature individuals do not love less intensely. In many cases, they love even more deeply. But their sense of identity, purpose, and emotional stability does not depend entirely on another person. Love becomes an addition to their life rather than the foundation of their existence. This balance allows people to experience connection without losing themselves within it. The paradox of love therefore becomes clearer. The more we love, the more vulnerable we become. But vulnerability is not simply a weakness. It is the doorway to the most meaningful experiences humans can share. Love exposes the heart. And because of that exposure, it also allows life to be experienced in its fullest emotional depth. In the end, the reason loving deeply can hurt so much is simple. When we truly love someone, we allow them into the most sacred spaces of our emotional world. And anything that enters those spaces gains the power to shape our happiness. Yet despite that risk, the human heart continues to choose love. Because a life protected from pain may be safe. But a life without deep connection is rarely meaningful. And perhaps that is the most profound truth about love. It is not the absence of vulnerability that makes life rich. It is the courage to open the heart, even knowing that it may one day break.